Growing up, I was what most people would call a bookworm. Back in those days, that wasn't something to be proud of. Today you hear people wear that label like it's something cool, almost like a personality trait to brag about. But when I was in high school, being called a nerd was closer to a punch in the gut than a compliment. High school was brutal in ways that seem almost hard to believe now. You could get roughed up just for listening to the wrong kind of music or not caring about whatever sport everyone else was obsessed with. It sounds like something out of a bad movie, but that was just the reality of it. Junior year hit us the hardest. There was this kid, I'll call him Marcus, who made that entire school year miserable for me and my friends. He was one of those guys who thrived on making other people feel small. Near the end of the year, Marcus decided it would be a brilliant idea to break into our school after hours. His plan was to pull some kind of dramatic prank that would cement his legacy as the coolest guy in school. Spoiler alert, it didn't go the way he planned. He got caught. But before I get into what happened next, let me give you some background on the school itself. The building is now permanently closed, but at the time, it was one of the more prestigious private schools in the area. We wore uniforms, attended chapel services during school hours, and the whole place had this heavy, old-world atmosphere. The building itself was ancient, and I mean that literally. Before it became a school, sometime in the early 1900s, it had operated as a medical facility for patients suffering from infectious diseases. When construction crews expanded the property back in the 1950s and started digging up the grounds, they reportedly unearthed a significant number of skeletal remains. The story goes that back in the days of the old hospital, when patients died from tuberculosis or other contagious illnesses, the staff didn't always follow proper burial procedures. Instead, bodies were sometimes disposed of through an underground tunnel that once connected the main hospital building to a secondary structure nearby. Whether every detail of that story was entirely accurate, nobody could say for certain. But those stories have been passed down through generations of students, growing more elaborate with each retelling, until they had taken on a life of their own, like a dark mythology specific to our school. The building's age alone was enough to make it unsettling. Pipes groaned in the walls. Doors creaked without being touched. Lights would flicker in empty hallways. The easy explanation was that the place was old and falling apart, which it was. But the student body had a far more entertaining theory. The school was haunted. The rumor mill had been running for decades, whispering about restless souls, about shadows that moved on their own, about voices that had no source. Now, back to Marcus. His prank was more destructive than clever. He broke in through a side entrance, ransacked several classrooms, threw papers around, and even made his way to the library where he pulled entire shelves of books onto the floor. The crown jewel of his grand plan was stealing red paint from the art room and writing fake horror movie messages across the lockers. Things like, "Get out while you can," and "They're still here." Real original stuff. But here's where it gets interesting. While he was in the middle of his little performance, Marcus claimed he heard something coming from the direction of the basement. He walked to the basement door, and according to him, before he even opened it, he could see shadows moving beneath a crack and hear voices rising up from the darkness below. He described it as something low and wrong, not like regular voices at all. Whatever it was scared him badly enough that he abandoned the whole prank and ran. He didn't get far, though. The school matched the red paint handwriting to Marcus within days, and he was expelled the following week. What I remember most wasn't the expulsion itself. It was the way he was screaming as they escorted him out of the principal's office. He kept insisting there was something evil living in the basement. He was absolutely hysterical about it. My friends and I had zero sympathy for him. He'd made our lives miserable all year, and as far as we were concerned, he got exactly what he deserved. But the rest of the school? They practically turned him into a martyr. Suddenly Marcus was this brave, tormented soul who had encountered something supernatural and paid the price. For the final weeks of the school year, we had to listen to people talk about how courageous he was, how he could have died, how the ghosts had finally shown themselves. It was exhausting. That's when I had what I can only describe as either a brilliant idea or a catastrophically stupid one, depending on how you look at it. With just a few weeks left before summer, I suggested to my friends that we do what Marcus couldn't. We'd break into the school ourselves, go down to the basement, prove there was nothing there, and expose Marcus as the dramatic liar we all knew him to be. Everyone agreed. The plan was simple. Get in quietly, reach the basement, confirm it was just a basement, and leave. No vandalism, no theatrics. If we heard anything strange, we run immediately. We had one major advantage Marcus didn't have. My friend Carson's mother worked as a janitor at the school and had a copy of the key. Carson quietly borrowed it without asking, and just like that, we had access. The night we chose was a cool one for early summer. We all showed up in dark hoodies and sweatpants, trying our best to look inconspicuous, which probably made us look more suspicious than if we just worn normal clothes. We let ourselves in through the rear entrance and immediately felt the shift in atmosphere. There's something deeply wrong about being inside your school after dark. Every instinct in your body is telling you that you shouldn't be there. The familiar hallways felt completely foreign. Lockers that looked perfectly ordinary during the day seemed somehow threatening in the dark. It was the kind of place that makes your brain fill in the blanks with things that aren't there. We made our way through the building without incident until we reached the basement door. I told myself I wasn't scared. But when Carson grabbed the handle of that basement door and pulled it open, what we saw at the bottom of those stairs changed everything. And that was before we found the hole in the wall. The door swung open to reveal a dark staircase that dropped into an even darker space below. Carson went first, flashlight in hand. The rest of us followed close behind, none of us willing to admit how uneasy we actually were. The basement was exactly what you'd expect from an old building like that. Enormous, dusty, and filled with decades of accumulated junk. Cardboard boxes were stacked in uneven towers along the walls. We pried a few open as we walked through. Old textbooks from the 1970s, faded Christmas decorations, extra uniforms still wrapped in plastic. What unnerved me most, personally, was the religious statuary. The school had apparently stored a collection of old church figures down there. Tall, pale, carved saints with hollow eyes and arms outstretched. I know it's irrational, but something about old religious figures in dark spaces gets under my skin in a way I can't fully explain. There's a stillness to them that feels wrong. We continued moving through the basement. The further in we went, the more we realized just how large the space actually was. Our flashlight beams couldn't even reach the far wall. For a building that looked modest from the outside, the basement seemed to stretch on indefinitely. Then we found the corner. One section of the basement felt noticeably colder than the rest. We moved a few stacked boxes aside, and behind them, partially concealed, was a hole in the wall. Not a crack, a deliberate opening, roughly the size of a large beach ball. Just wide enough to squeeze through if you were willing to get on your hands and knees. We shone our flashlights through it. The beam disappeared into darkness on the other side. It looked exactly like what the old stories had described, a tunnel. Possibly the same one where the hospital staff had once disposed of the bodies. Carson, of course, wanted to go in. The rest of us were firmly opposed. But he had a point. If we really wanted to put the ghost stories to rest, this was the spot. We argued for a minute, then settled it the way teenagers settle everything: rock, paper, scissors. I lost. I got down on my hands and knees, and started crawling into the opening. My flashlight barely illuminated the space in front of me. The walls were close on either side, and the air had that distinct underground smell, old, damp, and stale. I could hear my friends behind me, whispering and laughing nervously. Then I heard something else. I stopped. The sound was faint, a low, continuous noise that I couldn't immediately place. Not wind. Not a pipe. Something more like a rush of air through a narrow passage, but with a strange, irregular rhythm to it. I called back to my friends to be quiet. They hushed immediately when they heard the edge in my voice. I listened harder, and then the sound shifted. It started to change, to modulate, almost like it was transitioning from ambient noise into something that resembled a whisper. I called out into the tunnel, asking if anyone was there. The sound grew louder for a moment, then went completely silent. I stayed frozen, not moving, not breathing. Then I pointed my flashlight further down the tunnel. About 15 feet ahead of me, crouching in the darkness, was a person. The figure was hunched low, completely motionless, staring back at me. I could see that they were extremely thin, gaunt in a way that looked almost skeletal. No shirt. Ribs visible. Their skin was pallid, and their posture was wrong, bent in a way that didn't look natural. Their eyes were half open, vacant, not the eyes of someone startled or afraid, but the eyes of something that had been waiting in the dark for a long time. I shouted. Not words, just a sound. Pure shock. The figure didn't flinch, didn't speak, just stared. I started crawling backward as fast as I could, and that's when it moved. Not slowly, not cautiously, it lunged forward in that same low crouch, covering the distance between us in an instant. It was making a sound I had never heard before and haven't heard since. Not screaming, not speaking, something more primal than either of those. I burst out of the tunnel opening and scrambled to my feet. My friends took one look at my face, and then at the figure crawling out of the hole behind me, and that was the end of any curiosity anyone had about that basement. We ran. We hit the staircase at full speed, shoved through the basement door, and slammed it shut behind us. For a moment, we could hear movement below, but it didn't follow us up the stairs. We didn't stop running until we were outside and a full block away. The four of us sat on someone's front steps for a long time without speaking. My logical mind eventually caught up with me. The tunnel had to connect to something. A sewer line, a drain system, some kind of underground passage that led out somewhere nearby. The person we saw was probably someone living rough, someone who had discovered the shelter beneath the school and made it their space. The strange eyes, the unnatural crouching, those things can be explained by malnourishment, by substance use, by any number of things that have nothing to do with the supernatural. That's the explanation I settled on that night. It's the one I still hold on to. But those eyes, I've never been able to fully account for them. There was something behind them, or more accurately, something completely absent from them, that I've never encountered in another person before or since. The school closed down permanently several years ago. When I heard the news, my first thought was of that tunnel. I wonder sometimes if it's still there, sealed beneath whatever they built over it. And I wonder about whoever was living down there. I hope they found somewhere better to go. That wasn't the last time an end-of-school celebration turned dangerous. In the next story, what started as a harmless costume party ended with someone swinging a baseball bat at my head, and the person behind it had driven 8 hours just to find me. There's nothing quite like the feeling of finishing finals and finally getting to go home. After nearly a full year away at college, 8 hours from my hometown, I was ready to decompress. More importantly, I was ready to see my people again. We'd been planning a reunion party for weeks, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, the excitement was almost unbearable. The gathering was being held at my friend Logan's place. His family had one of those properties that seemed purpose-built for hosting. A large house set well back from the road, a pool, a sprawling backyard with space for a bonfire, and most critically, parents who were conveniently going to be out of town that weekend. It was the kind of setup that felt almost too good to be true. Before guests started arriving, Logan floated an idea. Since most of us had been away for Halloween, why not make this a costume party? It seemed absurd for late May, but nobody argued. We spread the word, made a last-minute grocery run that yielded exactly 1 bag of candy corn, and scrambled to throw together whatever costumes we could find on short notice. I dug an old hockey mask out of a box in my basement and went with it. By 10 o'clock, the party was alive. People showed up in droves, far more than had been invited, which is how every party like this goes. The costumes ranged from impressive to genuinely baffling. Logan didn't seem to mind the overflow. With the music up and the bonfire going, the whole thing had a chaotic energy that felt exactly right for the first night of summer. I was on the back deck a few hours in, telling a story that was probably funnier in my head, when something caught my eye through the sliding glass door. Standing just inside the house was a girl I didn't recognize. She was wearing a masquerade-style mask, ornate gold, the kind that covered the upper half of the face. She appeared to be alone, holding a drink, and looking directly at me. I waved. She waved back. I asked around. Nobody on the deck had any idea who she was. With a party this size, and everyone in costume, that wasn't especially surprising. I went inside to introduce myself, but by the time I crossed the threshold, she'd already moved deeper into the house. I did a quick scan of the rooms and didn't find her. I went back outside and tried to forget about it. But every few minutes, I found myself scanning the party for that gold mask. I didn't see her again for a couple of hours. Then, while I was in the pool, still wearing my hockey mask, because why not, I spotted her walking alone across the back of the yard toward the tree line. Logan's property backed up to a small wooded area, and she was heading straight for it. I called out a few times, but either the music was too loud or she wasn't listening. When she reached the edge of the trees, she stopped, turned, and waved at me again. Then she gestured, clearly, unmistakably, for me to follow her. I got out of the pool. By the time I crossed the yard, she was already in the trees. I stood at the edge of the forest and called out. A voice came back from somewhere in the dark, soft, unhurried, like we had all the time in the world. She said not to go back yet, said to come find her. I went in. What happened next in those woods is something I still think about. Because the girl with the gold mask wasn't a stranger, and she hadn't driven 8 hours to the party for a good time. She'd come for me specifically. And she wasn't alone. I moved through the trees, following her voice. A few feet in, I found her gold mask lying on the ground. I picked it up and kept walking. She kept talking, telling me she could see me, telling me to keep going, dropping in comments that were clearly meant to keep me moving forward. And it worked. Looking back, I was so caught up in the moment that I had completely lost any sense of caution. Eventually, I saw her silhouette a few feet ahead of me. It was dark under the canopy, and her hair was hanging forward, partially covering her face. She asked me to bring her mask over. I walked toward her. She didn't move, didn't extend her hand, just waited. When I was a few feet away, I told her my name. She said, quietly, that she already knew who I was. That stopped me. I recognized the voice. I couldn't immediately place it, but I knew it. It was familiar in a way that my brain was working hard to identify. I thought maybe it was someone from high school. When I was close enough that she couldn't ignore me anymore, she finally lifted her head. I knew her. She was a friend of a girl I had briefly dated during my first year of college. The same college that was 8 hours away from where we were standing. My mind went immediately to the obvious question, what was she doing here? She took one step back. From my left, I heard branches snapping, not the sound of an animal, but the deliberate, heavy sound of someone moving quickly through underbrush. I turned toward the noise and barely had time to register what I was seeing before my ex-girlfriend came charging out of the darkness, both hands gripping a metal baseball bat, swinging it directly at my head. I dropped. Pure instinct. The bat passed over me with a sound I can still hear if I think about it too hard. She screamed. Raised the bat again. I was already on my feet and running before the second swing came down. I don't remember making a decision to run. My body just did it, covering the distance back to the party faster than I probably ever had on a track. I burst out of the tree line screaming that there were people in the woods. The energy at the party shifted immediately. Logan cleared most people out within minutes, but he refused to call the police. He didn't want to invite trouble over the party. I couldn't blame him, exactly, but I spent that entire night wedged against a wall watching the back windows, waiting for movement along the tree line. The moment the sky started to lighten, I got in my car and drove home. The relationship I'd had with this girl had lasted only a few weeks. I'd ended it because she showed signs of being controlling, checking my phone constantly, showing up unexpectedly, tracking my schedule in ways that felt intrusive. I tried to end things as gently as I could, and I genuinely thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. She had coordinated with a friend, driven 8 hours, gotten herself into the party, and spent the better part of the night waiting for the right moment to lure me into the woods. That level of planning is something I've never been able to fully process. If that first swing had connected, I don't think I'd be here to write any of this. She didn't return to that college the following fall. I tracked her social media for a while out of genuine concern for my own safety, but eventually those accounts went quiet. I never had another encounter with her. That summer changed me in ways that are hard to articulate. I stopped putting myself in situations where I wasn't paying attention. I got serious about my life in a way I hadn't been before. And I became genuinely careful about how I ended things with people, not because I believe I did anything wrong, but because I learned that the impact of your actions on someone else can be wildly different from what you intended. Be thoughtful with people. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but because you often have no idea what's happening on the other side. The first two stories happened to students. The final story is different, because the person being watched, followed, and ultimately threatened wasn't a student at all. She was the teacher. And the threat was already inside her home before she even realized it had begun. Last spring, I landed my first real long-term position as a substitute teacher. I'd been filling in at various schools around the district for a while, but in April, a history teacher at one of the high schools I regularly covered went on maternity leave. I was offered the role through the end of the school year, roughly 3 months of steady work with the same group of students. I was thrilled. The assignment wasn't without its challenges. Senior students in the final stretch of the year are not exactly known for their enthusiasm. Most of them were already mentally checked out, counting down the days until graduation. I adapted by keeping things short and engaging. The curriculum had moved into government and civics, and rather than lecturing at them, I structured most of the class around discussion, real debates, competing perspectives, the kind of thing that actually requires you to think rather than just copy notes. It worked better than I expected. The students responded well, and by the end, I genuinely felt like I'd built something in that classroom on the final day of school. The morning wrapped up with an award ceremony. Students started filtering out in the early afternoon. Seniors were doing their goodbyes, taking photos, exchanging numbers. The hallways gradually emptied. When the last of the ceremony cleared out, I went back to my classroom to pack everything up. I wanted to leave the space exactly as I'd found it, organized, clean, and ready for the teacher who would return in the fall. I was almost finished when the principal stopped by and asked if I'd walk with him. We ended up talking for close to an hour. He told me he was impressed with what he'd seen, that the feedback from the students had been positive, and that he was going to look into bringing me back full-time in September. I left that conversation feeling better than I had in years. We parted ways near the front of the building, and I turned back to grab my purse from the classroom. The school was nearly empty by then, a few other teachers still tidying up, but that was it. When I pushed open the door to my classroom, I stopped. Standing near my desk, completely still, was one of my students. A quiet kid, always polite, always thoughtful in class. I'll call him Daniel. He was just standing there, not doing anything, not reaching for anything, just existing in a space he had no reason to be in. I asked him what he was doing. He looked at me and shrugged. No explanation. I asked if he was all right. He said yes, quietly, that he was just thinking. I told him he needed to leave. The school was effectively closed for the summer, and I wasn't comfortable with the situation. He started moving toward the door without argument. I thought that was the end of it. But when he reached the doorway, he paused. Didn't turn around. Just stood there for a moment looking at the hallway, and then said very softly, "Thank you. I'm sure I'll see you around." It's hard to explain why that phrase was unsettling. On paper, it sounds completely ordinary. But the way he said it, the flatness of it, the weight of it, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Every part of that interaction felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. After he left, I reached for my purse. I always keep it inside one of the desk drawers, but when I looked, it was sitting on the chair next to the desk. I checked it immediately. Everything appeared to be there, including the cash in my wallet. I assumed he tried to take something and changed his mind at the last moment. I filed it away and tried to put the whole thing out of my head. 3 nights later, I almost didn't. I almost convinced myself it had all been nothing. A strange kid, an odd moment, an overactive imagination. But 3 nights later, my husband found muddy footprints in our shed. And that same night, I walked into the hallway of my own home and came face to face with Daniel, standing outside my 7-year-old son's bedroom door, holding something in his hand. 3 nights after the last day of school, my husband and I were sitting by a fire in the backyard. Our son was spending the weekend at his cousin's house, so we had the place to ourselves for the first time in a while. It was a warm evening, and I was finally starting to feel like the school year tension was behind me. Then I heard something near the shed. A rustling, low, inconsistent, coming from the back of the yard. I told my husband it was probably an animal, and not to bother with it. We stayed outside until around midnight, and when we decided to head in, my husband said he wanted to check behind the shed before we went to bed. I laughed and told him not to get sprayed by whatever it was, and I went inside to get ready for bed. He was gone longer than I expected. When he finally came in, he told me what he'd found. Nothing behind the shed, but the shed door was slightly ajar. And inside, on the floor, what looked like muddy footprints. He'd gone back around to the rear to get a better look at the ground, and it seemed like someone had been standing there, though he wasn't certain enough to be sure. He thought maybe his mind was filling in details that weren't there. I wasn't especially worried. I assumed he'd forgotten to shut the shed properly. The next morning, I came downstairs before him and found the back door slightly open. Not wide open, just a few inches, enough to notice. I figured he'd been careless when he came in from the yard. I locked it and moved on. That night, he stayed up late watching a game. I fell asleep on the couch. When he woke me up to go to bed, I was half-conscious walking up the stairs. I got into bed but couldn't settle. Something felt off. That low, nameless anxiety that's hard to explain and impossible to ignore. I got up to go read in the living room. I stepped into the hallway and I froze. At the far end of the hall, outside my son's bedroom door, was a figure. Just standing there, completely still in the dark. My hand found the light switch. When the hall lit up, I saw his face. It was Daniel. He was inside my house, standing outside my 7-year-old son's bedroom, holding something in one hand that I couldn't quite make out from where I was standing. He looked at me, and he smiled. He said, "Hey, Mississippi Nice House." Then he walked into my son's room and closed the door. I don't fully remember the next 30 seconds. I know I ran back to the bedroom and called 911 while simultaneously shaking my husband awake. He was up and moving before I finished explaining, and he reached our son's room within seconds. When he opened the door, Daniel was already at the window, trying to work it open. My husband lunged for him, but Daniel jumped from a second-story window, hit the ground on his feet, and kept running. We waited inside with every light on until the police arrived. I told the officer exactly who he was and where he lived. They went to Daniel's house. His parents said he'd been home all evening. Daniel himself told the officers he'd been asleep for hours. The police came back and told me, as gently as they could, that without physical evidence connecting him specifically, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to call again if anything else happened. I barely left the house for the rest of that summer. We changed every lock. We installed cameras covering every angle of the property. My son spent most of those months at his cousin's house, because I couldn't bring myself to feel like our home was safe for him. My husband figured out how Daniel had likely gotten our address through my ID, which had been in my purse. That was what he'd been doing at my desk. Not stealing cash. Taking information. What I still can't shake is the image of him standing outside my son's bedroom door. My son was not home that night. But what if he had been? That question follows me everywhere. We've listed the house and are in the process of moving. When that's done, when I'm somewhere new, somewhere Daniel doesn't have an address for, maybe I'll finally be able to sleep through the night again. The last day of school is supposed to feel like freedom. For the students rushing out those doors, I hope it always does. But if you're ever alone in a building that's gone quiet, if something feels off in a way you can't explain, trust it. Don't wait for proof. Sometimes, the thing you're afraid of is already closer than you think.